All right, so we're diving into something today that I think a lot of people might shy away from, kind of tiptoe around. We're talking about sexless relationships.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that can bring up a lot of assumptions and even judgments, I think.
Absolutely. And honestly, even the term itself, sexless relationship, it can be kind of misleading, right? Like when you hear that, you might jump to a really extreme conclusion.
Right, like it's all or nothing, completely black and white, when the reality is so much more, well, nuanced.
Exactly. And thankfully, this deep dive that we're doing today, it really digs into those nuances. They made it clear that it's not always about a complete absence of sex.
Yeah, it's more about, like the podcast said, a significant decrease in sexual activity, one that starts to really impact the relationship dynamic.
Right, and that decrease is not always coming from the same place. Sometimes it's about mismatched libidos, which, let's be honest, is something most couples will probably experience at some point.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, desire fluctuates, right? It's totally natural, and it rarely, if ever, lines up perfectly between two people.
Exactly. But then you've got these other factors that can come into play, things that maybe put a strain on intimacy.
Yeah, like all the stuff life throws at you, stress at work, kids, maybe health issues that can really take a toll on anyone's sex life.
Totally. And it makes you realize that sometimes these relationships, they don't start as sexless. They kind of evolve that way over time because of circumstances.
Yeah, it's not always a conscious choice from day one.
Right. But then, and this is where it got really interesting for me, the podcast talked about how some people are intentionally prioritizing emotional intimacy. And that kind of challenges this idea that sex equals connection.
I found that really thought-provoking, too. Like, it really highlights how much potential there is for deep fulfillment and connection in a relationship, even if frequent sex isn't the core of it.
Which I think leads us to this big question.
Yeah.
Can a sexless relationship actually be healthy? Can it be satisfying?
And thankfully, they brought in an expert, Dr. Expert Name, to help answer that very question.
Right. So, what were some of the key takeaways you got from Dr. Expert Name?
Well, they really emphasized that communication is absolutely essential. But, and I love this Dr. Expert Name, actually suggested this technique called, get this, desire discrepancy dialogue, where couples actually schedule dedicated time to talk about these things.
Well, hold on. They actually put it on the calendar.
Yeah. The idea is to create this safe space where they can talk openly and honestly about their needs and concerns, without judgment.
That's incredible because I can see how otherwise all this stuff just gets bottled up. Resentment builds and assumptions get made. Having a dedicated time to talk about it just seems like so much healthier.
Totally. And Dr. Expert Name was also clear that it's not just about talking. It's also about finding other ways to, nourish that intimacy to make each other feel connected.
And speaking of real life examples, the podcast shared a couple of stories from people actually navigating this terrain. Listener A's experience really stood out to me, especially how focusing on non-sexual forms of intimacy actually brought them closer than ever.
I think what was so powerful about Listener A's story was how they redefined what intimacy looked like for them.
Yeah.
Instead of cuddling always being a prelude to sex, they really started to appreciate it as a meaningful expression of intimacy all on its own.
Yeah, it's like they found fulfillment in just the simple act of closeness, which is really beautiful.
Absolutely.
And then there was listener B who talked about how having kids really threw a wrench in their relationship, at least in terms of their sex life.
Yeah, and that's such a common experience, isn't it? Like, it's no surprise that couples often see a dip in sexual frequency after becoming parents.
For sure. So, how did listener B and their partner navigate that?
They talked about rediscovering the importance of date nights. And it didn't even have to be anything fancy, even just an hour after the kids went to bed, to just reconnect, have a real conversation that made a huge difference for them.
So, it really seems like that common thread here through all of this is communication,
Hmm.
and flexibility, being open to redefining what intimacy means within your own unique relationship.
I think that's a great way to put it.
And that's where I think the podcast's practical advice is really helpful. It all comes down to like checking in with your partner regularly, about your desires, your anxieties, any resentment that might be building, keeping that line of communication open seems absolutely paramount.
Couldn't agree more. And just to add to that, remember that it goes beyond just the words themselves. It's also about exploring those other forms of intimacy.
Hmm.
Touch, quality time, acts of service. those can be just as meaningful as sexual intimacy.
Totally. It's about figuring out what makes both of you feel loved and connected, and that might look different for every couple.
Absolutely. And, sometimes even with the best communication, these things can be really complex. So, don't hesitate to seek professional guidance if you need it. A therapist can really help provide tools and strategies tailored to your unique situation.
That is such good advice. This has honestly been such an eye-opening conversation. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with as they process all of this?
It just occurred to me, we've been talking about all of this in the context of romantic relationships, but this idea of like diverse forms of intimacy and connection, where else in our lives could that be relevant, right? How can we cultivate those deeper, more fulfilling connections with friends, with family members, even with ourselves through intentionality and openness? Something to think about.
I love that. What a great note to end on.